my name is Erin Farley, and I am one of JRSA's research associates. And for those of you who may be less familiar with JRSA, it stands for the Justice Research and Statistics Association. We are a national nonprofit organization dedicated to the use of research and analysis to inform criminal and juvenile justice decision-making. And we are comprised of a network of researchers and practitioners, which at the core include directors and staff from the state statistical analysis centers. Before we go any further, I would like to thank our partners at the Bureau of Justice Statistics for helping make this webinar possible. And so it is my pleasure today to welcome you to our webinar titled Communicating and Disseminating Research Findings. And this webinar will be led by Dr. Casey Paul. And Casey is the adult and online learning specialist here at JRSA. She worked as a public teacher before getting her PhD in curriculum and instruction from North Carolina State University. And she specializes in disseminating knowledge and communicating research findings to various audiences through e-learning, social media, research reports, policy briefs, and infographics. So we're really excited to have Casey as a new staff member here at JRSA, and so we are excited also to show what she knows and her specialty to you all who are on our webinar today. So welcome, Casey, and I will pass it off to you and pass you the magical ball, and the power is yours.
Thank you.
There you go.
Share my screen. Hi everyone, I'm excited to be here today and to tell you about communicating and disseminating research findings. So let's go ahead and get started. To start with, I wanted to give just a brief overview of what I'm going to be talking about. So I'm going to give a brief introduction to talk about why communicating and disseminating research is important, and then I'm going to go through steps of how you can figure out the message you want to communicate and then ways to disseminate that message. And I'm actually also going to walk you through how you can form a dissemination plan for your organization so that you can get started with all of this today. So first, I wanted to ask if you knew that it takes, on average, 17 years for research to become practice. This is actually a statistic from the health world. They do this research more often, I guess, than other fields, but you can imagine that if this is for medical and health, it might differ for some areas and could possibly be longer. And so this really highlights the gap between research and then the effect it can have on practice and policy. So that's really important to think about. Before we go forward, I wanted to do a quick poll, and you can just answer this in the chat below. What strategies do you use to communicate your research findings currently? If you don't have any, that's fine. But if you do, I would love to know where you are at in this process and where you might be looking to go forward. I'll give you a few minutes to do that. Okay. Oh, yeah. Awesome. So I'm seeing that some of you use reports, of course. You have a website. Some of you do fact sheets and infographics. All of this is awesome that you're already thinking about ways to communicate and disseminate your research so that people know what you're doing. So let's get started talking about communicating analytic findings. One of the things to keep in mind about why it's important to communicate analytic findings is that it really lends a greater purpose to the research we do. The research we do, just having it in a report and presenting it to stakeholders or grant funders is important, but if we can share it wider than that, hopefully we can have a bigger impact and affect policy and practice sooner than those 17 years that is the average currently. And so when we talk about communicating analytic findings, we're really talking about knowledge transfer, and this is a whole field of study. But just briefly, I wanted to share the definition of knowledge transfer. So it is the exchange, synthesis, and ethically sound application of research findings within a complex system of relationships among researchers and knowledge users. And you see there on the screen this image, which is one that has been created in the research on the field of knowledge transfer. And so we as researchers are, of course, in that center there, that knowledge creation, but when we want to communicate and disseminate our information, we get into that outer circle. And, often this outer circle is left off of the process of research, so we really want to make sure we pay attention to that. And while this chart here or graphic may look complicated, we can boil it down to saying that knowledge transfer really implies that knowledge should be a two-way street. And by that, we mean stakeholders would be aware of these research findings and decisions will be made based on the research that's being done. And that also public opinion is going to be informed by the research. And on the other side of that street, you have the researcher, and their research is hopefully being informed and driven by those stakeholders' needs and experiences, and their research can have a clear purpose and effect. And so both of these are in balance, and ideally these two sides of the street are always talking to each other so that they know what the other is doing. So when you're thinking about how you can communicate your analytic findings, some of the things you want to think about are who is the intended audience. So this may be policymakers, general public, or stakeholders. It may be all three depending on what you're communicating. And so depending on your audience, you really want to think about what platforms do they use, so where you can reach them at. For the public, social media is a great way to reach them. Obviously, for other academics, other stakeholders, they may read peer-reviewed journals, they may not. You can also think about websites, having your own website for your organization, or if there's other websites where you could share your information. When you're figuring out who is your intended audience, you want to think about what do they already know about the topic. For the general public, they may have less background knowledge than a researcher, so you might want to explain a little bit more about what led you to investigate a certain topic and what you already knew about it when you started. But for, of course, stakeholders, policymakers, other researchers, you may not need to go as in-depth. And then lastly, you want to tell your audience why should they care about the topic. You want to provide a so what. So if you tell them your findings and they were to say so what, you want to include that in your message. And again, the why they should care is going to differ depending on who they are. The public will have a different reason for caring than the policymakers, but you always want to put that in there. Also, in communicating your analytic findings, you want to think about the main message of your research. So this is especially important when you are reaching audiences who are maybe non-academic, the general public, or even policymakers perhaps. You might need to distill the thesis of your research if you're not just providing a research report. If you're, say, doing a memo or a policy brief, you're not going to have as many pages as that report. So you're really going to need to narrow down what you're saying. It can be very important to imply an action. And I've given you just a general example here of what I mean by implying an action. So that example would be, to end poverty, we need to create more good jobs and improve access to those jobs. So that's a statement that maybe my reader wouldn't agree with necessarily, but I have given an action based on my research to support what I'm saying. And you always want to do that so that your audience will know what they should do with the information you have given them. And then it can be important to center your message on a public issue or discussion, so this makes your research very timely and relevant, and connecting it in any way that you can to a hot topic is really important, and really helps with that so what issue too, of helping your audience know what they should do and why they should care about your research. And my computer seems to have frozen.
Oh, no.
Oh, hang on, here we go. There we go. All right, we're back. All right. So also in thinking about this, communicating your findings, you want to think about what are the main talking points. And again, this would be important for a memo, a policy brief. You know, you might not have to do this as much as if you have, you know, a 30-page research report you can write. But if you're trying to distill it down to make it shorter for different audiences, you want to think about synthesizing your research to short, informative facts. It can be very important to use non-technical language and avoid jargon or statistical language that your reader may not be familiar with. I like to say, write it like you might say it. So if you imagine a family member who is not in your field asking you what you were working on at work and you tell them, you might want to write it like you would tell your family member. So you might not use the jargon or statistical terms since they might not be familiar with them. And that can be a helpful way of thinking about how to write reports that aren't for other researchers. And then, of course, you can use graphs and images to better display statistical information. That is often easier for people to understand quickly than writing it out in text or than even using a table. Another thing that a lot of people aren't aware of is that Microsoft Word has a readability test that allows you to see readability statistics. It's called the Flesch Reading Ease Test. This can be very useful if you are writing for an audience that you don't typically write for. So if you typically write research reports for academics, but you want to write something for the public, this Reading Ease Test can make sure that you have made your writing easier to read than it normally would be. So the Reading Ease Test, it gives you a measure at the end, so the number should be between 60 and 70 for the general public. And this is calculated by the amount of words and the length of sentences, and there's a formula that goes into it that you can look up if you're curious. But to do this, you'll need to enable readability statistics in Microsoft Word by going into your options. And then you'll simply conduct a spell check, and once all the spelling errors are corrected, it will give you the reading statistic or readability statistics. And you can see your number and see how close it is to 60 or 70. It'll also give you an approximate grade level for the reading. So if it says, for example, grade 19, you've written a really complex document. And while that's fine for a research report, it might not be appropriate for the general public. So that's just a nice tool that you can have and that you can use if you need it. Another thing when you're communicating your findings is to contextualize the findings. This can be good, again, for policymakers, stakeholders, the public. If you provide a short story that personalizes that research and relates it to the stakeholders' lives, it really allows them to see how your research relates to them and how the effect that it can have. And then again, suggesting an action that can be taken can really help them see not only how this relates to them, but then what they should do with it. And then the last part of this is when you're thinking about how to communicate your findings, you want to frame your message. I included this quote from Foucault here, that language is not neutral, it is the power which is to be seized, and I think that thinking about that lets you see what you can really do with how you word things. And along the lines of this, you need to think about communicating your results in a relatable way, and I've already talked about contextualizing, so personal stories or anecdotes, metaphors, You can also contrast your message, so sometimes it's easier to talk about what something is not. And then I also have this phrase, spin it, and by that I don't mean fudging your results or anything, but more putting a certain spin on how you're saying it. And I have an example for that. Here we're going to see how important framing is. And for this activity, I encourage you to use the annotation tool that you have in WebEx. So if you mouse at the top of your screen, it should show participants chat, and you should see annotate on the right there, and you should be able to click on that and use the annotation tool. And it's going to ask me to approve you, and I, of course, will. So there'll be a pause. So I'm going to pause here and allow everybody to access the annotation tool. See, somebody's already drawing. That's awesome. Or maybe that's me. All right, and it's probably going to be easier on your annotation tools if you select the arrow that is on the far left of the annotation tools. That's the only one you should need for this activity. Let's see. My computer is frozen again. This is not liking my annotating. Hang on. There we go. Oh, now we have it. Okay. Let's see. All right. So you're just going to use your arrows for this. We can erase the annotations later once we move past. So I want to talk about how important is framing, and I want you to tell me which phrase is framed in the more positive way. So we have A, which is 94% of people survive the medical procedure, or B, 6% of people die from the medical procedure. So I want you to just put your arrow either over A or B, whatever you think is the most positive. And I'll give you a minute to do that. I'm going to erase your scribbles if you don't mind, no offense. All right, just so they're not in the way in the future. All right, and I see that a lot of you are saying A, and I have to say that I agree. A sounds a lot more better if I'm trying to make this medical procedure seem more positive. If I wanted to highlight to you the danger of this medical procedure, I might say B, right? 6% of people die from it. And as you can see, these give you the exact same statistic. I've just framed it in a way that highlights what I'm hoping to highlight. So we're going to go on and do one more of these. Oops, let's see. My computer seems to freeze up with my annotation tools. Maybe I have to. There we go. All right, so you can do the same thing here again, and you're going to annotate. So which phrase is framed in the more positive way again? So we have A, 3 people bought a membership, and B, membership grew by 33%. And again, you'll just use the arrow. You'll probably have to click on it again. Yeah, so a lot of you are saying B, right? And again, I've left out some information in this phrase, right? You don't know exactly how many I'm calculating for 33%, so that doesn't tell you exactly how many members, but 33% sounds a lot better than 3. But if I wanted to highlight this in a negative way, I might say only 3 people bought a membership if I'm trying to say, you know, out of, you know, we usually have 150 each month and only 3 people, well, that's not good. We've definitely gone down. So again, there's different ways to highlight positive and negative. We're going to do one more of these. So this one's a little bit different, as you'll see. It's, oops, let's go back. All right. This one is going to be the one in the more negative way. So A, 60% of participants saw results, and B, almost 1/2 of participants saw no results. So yeah, a lot of you are saying B. That is definitely more negative. It would make you more wary of using this product, if you will, especially if you wanted to, you know, look young, as it implies. So yeah, as you can see, these A and B from all of these said the same information, but they said it in different ways. So that's something you really want to pay attention to when you are communicating a message. All right, so I'm going to stop the annotations now. We'll move on to disseminating research findings. And so as you can tell, my talk about communicating research findings is a lot about identifying your audience and really crafting your message for who that is. So disseminating would be reaching that audience in different ways. And so some beginning steps you might want to take would be to create awareness and gain exposure. So this might mean creating awareness around your organization and getting people aware that you are out there and what you focus on. And you can do that on social media. You could start a blog. Maybe you already have a blog. Of course, you could do press reports if you know the media and if that's appropriate. You could have websites of partners. Obviously, you could have your own website as well, but partners can reach a broader audience that you might reach on your own. And then, of course, conferences. I know someone mentioned in the chat earlier that they use this as a way to disseminate information. You can also engage with your stakeholders throughout the process of research. A lot of people think of dissemination at the end of research projects, but it's actually something that can occur throughout the project. So with your stakeholders, you could provide updates on your projects as you complete different tasks so that you're building that excitement for the final findings as opposed to, you know, being silent throughout the project and then just delivering a report at the end. So when it comes to dissemination planning, it's important to think about several things. One of them is research findings and products. So what do you intend to disseminate and how often will you disseminate findings? Again, this is something that you should think about at the beginning of a project, not at the end, and hopefully you would have more than one item you can disseminate and that you would be able to disseminate findings throughout the project instead of just at the end. You also want to think about your end users. Who are they? How will they use the information? And can you get them involved in the dissemination process early on so they're not just receiving the information at the end, but throughout the project? You also want to think about dissemination partners. So who can help you get your findings to your end users? And this could be other partner organizations, this could be other stakeholders, anyone who can help share your message, your findings, anything that you have, they can help you get it out. Also, dissemination channels, what platforms will you use? Again, you could use social media if you're trying to reach the general public. You may use peer-reviewed journals if you want to reach an academic audience. You may use the media if you want to use or reach the general public. For your stakeholders, you may deliver it to them directly if that's most appropriate. But there are various channels for various audiences, so it's important to think about both of those together. And then, of course, at the end of your project, you also want to evaluate your dissemination plan. Did it work? Did you get your findings out there to the people you hoped to get them to? And if not, you'll want to think about how you can address that and how you can change it going forward. I have given you a link here to a dissemination planning worksheet. So this is something that you could print out and use if you're ever planning a new project or if you're doing a grant proposal. You could use this to think about the dissemination process and plan it for your project. And again, you want to do this at the beginning, not at the end, to make sure that there's funds for it and that it is throughout the project. But this worksheet can help you do that. And then, let's see, we're going to do our poll now. This is not our poll for the webinar evaluation. This is a poll to help us kind of know where we want to go with this series, what else you might want to know about communicating and disseminating research. So you can either click on that link. I'm not sure if that will work, but I will also put this link in the chat so that you can just access it there. And then we'll move on to questions. So that link is in the chat now if you just want to click on it from there. And I can move on to any questions that you may have. And of course, you will have time to take the poll. It will stay open, so you can take it now or in a few minutes, either way. But I will wait if you are taking it now. And I should say it's only 6 questions, so it will not take you long.
So while we're doing that, I might take the magic ball and open up the other one.
Yeah, that's fine too.
Okay, great. All right. So this is Erin Farley. Just chiming in real quickly to say that we also have just just a very small number of questions at the end of every webinar we do as well. So this is a little different. Just I'm just about to launch the poll. So if you have a chance to answer these questions as well, and that will be really helpful to us. Let me go ahead and okay. Okay, so while we're waiting for people to complete the poll and possibly ask any questions for Casey, I just want to remind everyone that we do have a webinar in May, towards the end of May. That announcement should be released very soon, probably sometime next week. So keep your eyes out for that. And then we do have a June webinar on the JSAP program that is focused or directed towards state statistical analysis centers. And then we will have more coming throughout the summer, so keep your eyes open. Do you see that question?
Oh, yeah. Someone has pointed out that if any facts have findings from work related to juvenile justice and want to reach judges, you can submit articles to Juvenile and Family Court Journal, and the email is in the chat box there, so that's great, a great place that you can disseminate your work if you are researching that topic.
There's one from Emily.
Oh, I don't see that one.
Oh, it might have just, okay, it might just be me. So there is another question that is, how can you effectively engage the general public / non-policymakers in order to curate a bigger following while simultaneously not losing the policymakers / researchers that already follow you?
That's a great question, and actually something I've been thinking about a lot. I think that often policymakers and what was the other? Public and
general
policy.
public and non-policy makers.
Non-policy.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think that often groups of policymakers and researchers are going to be looking in different places for information. So if you are working towards the general public, you will definitely want to be in different places, and I think you might not necessarily lose your following because you are working in those different places. I also think that there's sometimes, some researchers really care about making their work known, so I think serving as a platform where they can do that can actually be enticing to them. So I think they might respect that you are working to reach the general public. So I don't necessarily think it's an either or. I think you can reach both audiences, but you do have to make sure you have a very broad reach and that you are sharing your information in different places, because researchers, policymakers, and the general public are not going to be looking at the same sources. So yeah, I hope that answers your question, and if not, feel free to pose a different one or to ask a little bit more for more detail.
Okay, well, it doesn't look like we have any additional questions at this point, but again, Casey is here at JRSA, so you can find her on our website if you want to follow up and reach out to her personally. And we thank everyone for attending the webinar today, and hopefully we'll see you at future webinars. So thank you so much. Thank you, Casey.
Thank you.
Have a good afternoon, everybody. Take care.